Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 27 cheat sheet. After that abomination of a Gameweek 26, at least for myself, right? Congratulations to people who triple captained Rice. We actually talked about that possibly in this video, but just from a risk perspective, it does make sense to sort of bet against the field at times, or just a general Rice captaincy, right? I can understand probably the triple captaincy could have swung it back to Gabriel, especially as you get that exclusive sort of additional ownership of the defense. Has it categorically failed? Yeah, I would say so. 7 points is not the worst in terms of triple captaincy. I think I've seen worse. Admittedly, I don't think I've had worse myself, so excuse myself if I'm not the happiest recording this video. But we're looking ahead towards Game Week 27. There's a couple game weeks left until blank Game Week 31. Still think there's a lot of scope for different picks to do well. From a team macro perspective, Liverpool, Aston Villa, United, Brentford, of course, I think at the top of people's lists are interesting. And amongst that, of course, we have a lot of cheat sheet changes. So if you've never seen the cheat sheet, it's effectively a tier list of players across all positions in FPL, looking at that sort of price point and the valuation of the player across, the whole scope of the game. So midfields, forwards, defenders, all kind of rated in terms of what I think generically good team structures are. So a lot of the data that you can see as well within this video will also be supported by the OptaStats tool. It's a tool which you can find within the link in description below. It gives you all the tools and I would say data that you need to sort of succeed, alongside, of course, the expected points model from Fantasy Football Hub if you're interested in that, and even getting suggested transfers, right? So let's jump into the cheat sheet. To me, I think Lafay deserves to drop. Part of this, I think, is Sutherland's fixture run is going to get worse. Another element, I suppose, is I still think the DEFCON numbers aren't good enough. And then, of course, Diarra's just taken the last penalty. I don't think there's many guarantees that Lafay will take the next one, even though you can say that that's in doubt. So to me, he gets that drop. Adley has been added towards the cheat sheet. He's an extremely cheap pick. I mean, Ryan as well, but Ryan's in the next tier. But effectively in this sort of 5.0, 5.5 tier, I think you've got some absolutely great DEFCON monsters. And then you've got players like Adley who have very interesting underlying stats, more from a kind of open play perspective. When you compare, for example, to the likes of Buendia, I mean, Buendia, if you knew he had perfect minutes, would be a really good pick. And I think right now, Adley's at least in a state right now where his minutes have actually improved. At the start of the season, he was not really getting the minutes. And I don't think it's something to do with Semenyo necessarily, but also just, he himself has kind of run into a good set of form here. And so Ryan himself has kind of stepped into that role on the right-hand side, and I think he could probably lock that down. So a huge benefit now to have two Bournemouth midfielders at very good price points who have really good underlying stats. Now with Ryan, I think the sample size is extremely small, but if you actually go back to his numbers within Serie A and in the Brasileiro, I think his numbers were actually really good. They were more XG tilted. So far, of course, him actually having a little bit of XG, showing a little bit of creativity within the recent matches is a positive. But I think let's not overreact to some of the numbers so far, but I think maybe you can just say you can trust, let's say, a team like Bournemouth and how they've been able to kind of develop players. I think just the simple fact that Iraola is more confident in giving someone like Ryan more minutes than Krupi says a lot, just in terms of how Ryan's minutes could pan out over the next few weeks. And yeah, I mean, even touching 90 minutes is extremely impressive. So definitely a bit jealous as a Krupi Jr. owner of some of the other sort of Bournemouth potential picks in the midfield now. And I think they're all quite interesting. Anderson and Garner still top just because of, how excellent they are in DEFCON. And Casemiro, I feel like a positive that now we're seeing just more consistent minutes, and he himself will just get the space to get minutes in almost every single match because the rest is a little bit more measured for a player like Casemiro with the sort of element of United not being involved in a lot of cup competitions. As far as Somerville, I think this is a drop that is really just going against the backdrop of West Ham's fixtures, turning a little bit worse now. So this to me is probably the last good West Ham game. And then you have a mixture of pretty poor away games and then some tougher home games, but, occasionally a decent home game here and there. And I think that's probably not good enough to justify Somerville being a green pick. He clearly is probably a player who's still absolutely, at the top of his game, just scored in the FA Cup as well, coming off the bench, and the minutes is still perfect. So, is there much to really be said that Somerville will get knocked off massively? No, I think this is kind of like if you were owning Harry Wilson over a pretty poor run of games. And of course, I think the additional pieces, he's not on as many set pieces, right? So Harry Wilson, on the other hand, I think is about to re-enter basically a pretty good run of fixtures himself. So that's kind of why in the next tier, we've also given him a rise. With Sobo, I think this is very much the same situation as well. he doesn't have the underlying stats really to kind of suggest that he's a top pick, but he is more of an all-rounder, not too far off from, let's say, an Njai again. Doesn't have the penalties, but then I think the set piece sort of threat from Sobo, the bonus element as well, is very massive in terms of making him a very good, well-rounded pick in FPL. And still the open play threat is there. We saw the goal versus Brighton, so he is capable of doing that. And then I suppose you can always apply, I guess, the positive finisher inflation if you really want to do so. I mean, he does seem to be generally one of the best free kick takers we have right now in the Premier League. So yeah, a huge positive there that kind of can gloss over the slightly poor NPXG per 90 from Sobo. As far as Ahmad and Enzo, I think they both drop. I feel a bit harsh on Ahmad because I still think the numbers for him have looked pretty good. They have tapered off a little bit, I think, with the sort of new role. I still like United's attack. I don't think the West Ham game was the best showing of it so far, and of course it kind of goes in line with some of the people's potential concerns for this United team versus what we call a quote unquote low block. I still think for the most part that there will be games, yes, of course, where United can be shut out, but for the most part, their attack, has a lot of quality. And I don't think much has fundamentally changed my opinion on that. And I still think that he's a player who's more impervious to minute shifts, even if, let's say, a couple of role changes happen within the team in terms of setup, right? So, for example, let's say if Sesko's to play more games going forwards versus certain types of oppositions, I still think Cunha is the first one to lose out minutes. Ahmad's role in terms of sort of holding position on the right, and then also his sort of defensive presence as well, more from a sort of pressing perspective, and then just in general his ability to kind of support, I think, the fullback in Dalot at times, when Dalot, for example, goes a little bit towards the interior, is quite evident. Whereas, with someone like Cunha, when you actually watch him play, the interrelation with him and Mbeumo, I would think, is actually Cunha goes a little bit more inside at times, out of possession. And Mbeumo actually tends to take on that sort of left wing type role. Whereas, of course, if Sesko's going to come in, I still think Cunha just drops out of the picture entirely. Whereas Ahmad has pretty much made that position his on the right hand side. So all that to say, yes, maybe there's a bit of a diminishing of the sort of impact, I guess, from Ahmad. Another thing to mention is that he's recently given back some of the set pieces on that right hand side in the corner, taking back to Mbeumo. So I think that's a bit of a negative impact on Ahmad as well, something that I just wanted to take into account. As far as Enzo, part of the reason why he's dropping is just that, this is the last amazing Chelsea fixture. So of course, I'm not advocating anyone to sell Enzo after this week, but I think it is almost sort of making way for the idea that you just should be prepared to let go of someone like Enzo ahead of what is a pretty tough fixture run. Now, FPL is a game where, of course, Enzo, I think, with the underlying stats that he's had this season, you'll never feel too bad owning someone like that. And of course, he can still do well in spite of the tougher fixtures. But I think because there's so much variety right now within the game, and there's so much value in terms of, I guess, jumping off terrible fixtures into good fixture runs for very interestingly priced players from Brentford, like a Dango, or even some of the Bournemouth players, I do think there's enough scope to say Enzo's worth a sell. As far as the other tiers, I've actually dropped Rice. Now, this comes off of Rice actually hauling within a double game week, but I do think that the double game week has to, come into account here, where the DEFCON numbers were exceptional within the double game week. He hit DEFCON twice, I think quite easily and comfortably as well. You could argue that that's maybe slightly opponent dependent too. But yeah, I still think that as a sort of standalone midfield pick, I don't think Rice is necessarily still sort of at the level of some of the other players in open play, like even a Bruno G this season, who I think has sort of taken his game towards a new level. Unfortunately, of course, with the hamstring injury as well, that seems to be quite significant. But coming out of the double with single game weeks left to go, I think Rice actually is someone that you could still consider transferring out of your team. He's not really in the Enzo camp of having terrible fixtures, and I think he's a bit more impervious to terrible fixtures because as a bit of a DEFCONer or a consistent DEFCONer, the beauty, I suppose, of holding up someone in that position like Rice in FPL is you don't really have to think too hard about whether that player is worth transferring in. I think there is scope to sort of improve, like maybe pushing towards Semenyo, but that once again is if you have that sort of free transfer cushion. Same with Rodgers as well. So I don't feel too bad about anyone who wants to hold Rice up until the blank game week 31. But with that in mind, that's kind of why also the backdrop is Arsenal players are starting to drop on the cheat sheet where it makes sense for me to drop them. I've added Gordon back into the cheat sheet. He's back now. Scored 4 goals versus Karabag. Does that really matter? Does that really change or influence our decisions? Not really. But I think it helps, of course, that Bruno G's out. That kind of guarantees a bit more pen share across the games. And I think his own personal form, I suppose, which includes the Champions League, probably just means more minutes within the Premier League too. he's just going to be a differential for me. Nothing else to say there. With Cunha, I think there are genuine fears about, his minutes and whether Sesko is able to sort of claim more going forwards. And for that reason, I think I'm going to drop him. I think, as you can see anyways, with all the Carrick sort of lineups, the early substitutions, he does seem to be that sort of player who is more obviously the odd one out compared to, let's say, Mbeumo, compared to, let's say, Ahmad. So I do think going forwards, he's someone whose minutes will probably be a bit more fragile. And we've already started to see that, baked in. Salah, to me, gets a rise. This is just simply due to the fixture landscape for Liverpool. He's played a touch better recently. I don't think, that he's made leaps and strides. I don't think Ramadan is someone that I'm even going to take into account in terms of trying to sort of make a conjecture over a single sort of solitary player and whether their performance will be impacted over this run. I just think simply the minutes look like they're absolutely there for Salah. And you can even look at a player like Palmer as a good example for this in FPL. But a player doesn't necessarily need to be playing the best in open play if they play for a team that in theory should have other routes towards points, right? We're seeing Salah take set pieces, so he takes those right-hand side corners. You're starting to see Salah as well on free kicks. There's value there. You're starting to also see, Salah play 90 minutes, which means that as a penalty taker, he should stand to benefit. Just kind of like when Sobo took a penalty and completely missed it. I mean, that's scope for points, right? So I think Salah just makes a lot of sense. All these things in general should also be inflated when you play versus worse opponents and worse defenses. So I still think, as much as we can criticize Salah in open play this season, as much as we can criticize some of the numbers, in relation to the price point, I still think there's a lot of scope to say Salah makes a lot of sense going forward as a transfer. So he gets a rise. In the forward position, moving over to that now, Strand Larson was added last week. I don't think I've really changed my opinion in terms of him. I still think that if you actually look back and revisit the chances versus Burnley, it's not like they were clear-cut amazing chances. I don't think he's necessarily on penalties over Sarr. So I think the jury's still out there. Great finishes versus Burnley, though. But yeah, I mean, the fixtures do turn quite quickly after Wolves at home. So it's very hard to justify making him green. Mane is going to have a blank Gameweek 31 soon, so he definitely deserves a drop, but I'm not going to drop him this week. I mean, these types of picks in terms of the Krupa Juniors and the Manes, at the bare minimum, they're still providing a lot more value than some of the other players within other positions, especially within the midfield, for example, like for like at the 4.5, 4.3 type tier. So there's still value there. And part of it as well is owning a Krupa Jr. and a Mane, I think, is still probably within the best types of structures that you can find within FPL. I know recently people have moved into more of a 3-4-3 type structure, especially for those who are consolidating, let's say, on the position of holding Haaland in their teams, and maybe not considering that switch towards Salah, especially as, let's say, the likes of Saka and Palmer, until recently, of course, have not been interesting for people in FPL. Same with Salah. So I can understand why people are adopting a structure that still has even maybe the double of Krupa Jr. and Mane. As far as, let's say, rest of the cheat sheet movements, Raul is still yellow, and I haven't touched him, but I do think that it's worth mentioning that Muniz is around the corner. So for anyone who's actually interested in sort of investing into this Fulham run, something to think about there, where I think maybe you'd probably like to skirt around Raul, even though he could look interesting from a fixture point of view. With Calvert-Lewin, I think he's still probably my favorite pick altogether if you kind of compare the players in that 5.5 to 6.5 million tier. But in reality, a lot of the bread is buttered in that 7 million tier and above. Thiago is about to enter into the most luxurious fixture run. João Pedro's numbers have actually been excellent this season. His minutes under Rosinho have looked really good. The underlying stats under Rosinho have looked really good. So I think he's benefited the most probably out of all the forwards in recent times with, a managerial change. It is hard to justify sort of continuously making moves towards players like João Pedro, especially when the fixtures do turn. So I still think that I'd caution probably not having to make such aggressive transfers towards João Pedro now. It almost does feel like the boat has been missed in terms of if you want to make a Chelsea transfer, unless once again you've got, let's say, scope to have 3 to 4 free transfers in the bank, you can go for João Pedro, maybe consider captaining him versus Burnley at home. But that's how I feel about João Pedro. With Thiago, though, this is the fixture run, as I said. So to me, I think he's close to essential over the next 2 to 3 weeks as a buy. And this is a pick that will serve most people well, going forwards, or at least up until blank Gameweek 31. As far as Ekitike, I've given him a very, very soft drop. I do think it's a bit harsh, Liverpool are about to enter into a really good fixture run, but I still think that his minutes are not, tip top compared to some of the other Liverpool attackers or options that you can choose from. And then, of course, there's a price point piece there too, and the lack of penalties compared to some of the other forwards within the game. The underlying stats have been really healthy, but of course, do note that some of the other players here on this list are more close to 90-minute players than Ekitike. I think so far you've seen, of course, Slot seems to want to play Ekitike as much as humanly possible, which includes, for example, resting him in FA Cup games where possible. But there will be an impact anyways when Liverpool have fixtures around their first set of Champions League playoff games. So that's going to have a little bit of a latter impact on Ekitike. And I think there are murmurs potentially that Isak, could be coming back soon. That could still be completely far off base, but yeah, just something to think about in terms of Ekitike. As far as the Haaland piece of news, I've chosen not to react to Haaland news. We've seen him in training. I don't think I'm really going to make any movements around Haaland. I think that in FPL, we tend to sort of play a game where, of course, we do think about the downsides of not owning someone who's extremely highly owned without sort of paying respect to the opportunity that you can actually go and skirt around that at times. And I do think coming out of the Newcastle at home fixture, there is a pretty good opportunity for people to kind of move away from Haaland and maybe reorganize their team structure. Just so something that I'm just going to lay out there. I'm certainly considering it myself. I don't think I necessarily even need a Haaland injury for me to force moves around Haaland. But even just a natural transfer after the Newcastle at home game, which looks very appetizing right now, is on the cards for myself. But I can also see why people would not want to do that. And part of that is also we're very likely to wildcard back into Haaland if you have the wildcard left and you're planning to wildcard on 32, right? So once the blank gaming 31 passes, if you've dead ended without Haaland on your team, you're very likely to revisit an FPL template when you wildcard with Haaland back. And so you might stand to lose several million in FPL. And maybe that's not something that you really want to deal with. But as the season closes in, I think there is scope to say if Haaland's minutes are a touch worse and he does blank in 31, that you have an opportunity to consider more riskier options to the people who want to do that. For defense, I actually haven't made too many changes. Admittedly, I think a lot of changes could happen the week after this one, because I think in defense, whilst I still have Richards and Maguire here, very clearly there's going to be a brutal swing here for a lot of the Crystal Palace players. I know I've, let's say, moved down someone like Enzo within the midfield position, but I think with defenders, especially with those who actually have DEFCON potential, you're a bit more insulated at times from what we call swings. There's still a good Leeds at home fixture in the distance for some of the Crystal Palace defenders. So I feel that it would be a bit too harsh sort of to downgrade them this week ahead of Wolves at home, which is still a great game despite what the latest result that Wolves have had versus Arsenal would probably lead you to believe, or at least the latest Crystal Palace result versus Burnley would have you believe. But Hill to me is probably the top defender in this bracket by a country mile. I think his DEFCON numbers are absolutely exceptional. I don't think you need to overread or underread into this too much. Sure, the sample size is small, but I think in his short time sort of playing very consistent minutes now, I think he's almost outperformed Senesi in DEFCON in a lot of key stats, for example, things like aerial duels, not just, for example, the amount of clearances he puts and gets DEFCON from. You can see Hill doing great work. Now, I think the offensive element of the game is probably a little bit overblown when you kind of look at the underlying data. I mean, some of the assists recently have been a bit fluky, but the DEFCON numbers are there, and I think he's so far clear of some of the other options now, and still has a very good fixture run for the most part, where I think it makes a lot of sense as a pick. Maguire does actually look very interesting, and I've talked within previous episodes about how I have liked the United defense, and it does line up with the overall picture of the season with the XGC that United have as a team. So they've been a pretty impressive defense. I do think there's a small asterisk with Maguire here, where as an owner myself, I think that the concern is, did he suffer a hamstring injury versus West Ham or did he not? Is Euro's performance good enough to sort of even, unseat Maguire? We don't know. I mean, until De Ligt is back, I still think it makes sense for me to not sort of overread that with Maguire, and I think he's still a good pick, but that does remain to be seen. I think I would personally just go with Adalo right now if I wanted to invest into that United defense. I think Everton away, despite it being an away match, is still actually a really good fixture on paper, just because United are very solid defense, and I don't think Everton are particularly good offense themselves, especially with sort of the key injuries, right? That being the backdrop of Everton's recent sort of underlying performances. Alderete did sort of suffer a potential injury. I'm not sure if he's fully fit. I think he should be totally fine. When I was looking at the Sunderland FA Cup game, unfortunately, it wasn't, great information because, of course, I think they had the opportunity to kind of rest most of their squad. And, for example, Mukiele actually played center back within that match. But going forwards, maybe he'll be fine. I think the key thing overall with Sunderland is that at this sort of price point, I really don't think I can be too harsh on any of the players here, especially when some of these players actually have really good DEFCON numbers to back it up and aren't, for example, I guess the quality defense that, let's say, a Burnley are. So not too many comments to make around this sort of price bucket. You have a lot of options. In the 4.5 plus tier, the only change that I've made is that Vandenberg has gotten a rise. I think Coyote might actually still be the best option if you want to just be invested in the Brentford defense, but I still think things like DEFCON do matter within the game. And I think Vandenberg is still a very solid pick from that perspective, right? He's not really a DEFCON at the level of, let's say, a Senesi, for example, or even some of the other options that we mentioned, like an Anderson in the past. But with a really good fixture run, with much higher expected clean sheets over this period than some of the other picks, potentially he's a player who's already usurped Collins. I think it's tricky for me to delve into a territory where I'm that certain, because I think we've seen Keith Andrew rotate center back pairings like he doesn't care. A lot of managers tend to like to keep central back pairings, or you see, for example, one player come in, one player come out. Instead, I think what we've suddenly moved from was when Vandenberg first got his injury, we saw Ayer come into the team playing alongside Collins. Then suddenly he was totally comfortable also just playing Vandenberg alongside Ayer when Collins was rumored to have a knock in training. And since then, Collins has not really played too much football, and Brentford have actually also gotten some massive results in that period, whilst Vandenberg and Ayer have kept their place. Now, maybe Ayer is actually a better option because I think his DEFCON numbers could be a bit marginally better. I am almost taking a call here that I think Vandenberg's minutes could be the safest out of the three. I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I've also been speaking to Brentford fans as of late, and I can tell you they're also wrong. So make of that the best that you will. O'Reilly, I've re-added to the cheat sheet. I just think that the minute security within the midfield position that he currently plays right now, despite Aït-Nouri also playing very well and sort of assuming left-back duties in recent times, has been a huge positive for O'Reilly, because you can see, of course, he can now score goals in open play again and get some really good underlying stats. But I think the key piece here is that as players have dropped out of the pecking order, players like Foden and players have sort of continually locked down their spots like Bernardo Silva, O'Reilly has really emerged within the midfield position that he sort of plays. And he is still someone who I think that Pep relies upon to provide what this team misses a lot, especially in terms of the sort of out of possession piece for Man City in the midfield. So O'Reilly has been excellent. I think he deserves to be re-added to the cheat sheet. But of course, the backdrop is Blank Gaming 31. Konate gets a rise. This is Liverpool about to jump into basically the best fixture run that any sort of defense will have over the next 5 games, Gameweek 31 included. And that's the key thing here with Liverpool, where almost there's a changing of the guard with, let's say, some of the Arsenal picks and, scope to move into some of the Liverpool picks. What I would say, though, is that on a pure sort of expected clean sheet basis up until Game Week 31, there's really no reason to make that sort of side grade move of, I don't know, maybe let's say a Timber to a Van Dijk or a Timber to Konate, but I can totally see why someone would want to make the move because Timber has been such a frustrating. So, something to mention too is in recent games, Timber's underlying stats have not been impressive whatsoever. I think over the course of the double game week, he actually had some pretty poor XGI. This isn't really how you should look at sample data, but amongst the backdrop of many Timber seasons, we've seen, worse seasons in terms of underlying stats. People a couple of weeks ago were touting how excellent Timber was as an option in attacking sort of opportunities and how he's been able to accumulate XG, but then that's also suddenly clawed back after a few poor games where he's just not really done much, right? Despite, positionally, you can watch him play for Arsenal, see him sort of occupying positions, like let's say amongst center backs from the opposing team, and just kind of infer that he's going to be in good opportunities all the time. The reality is I think Timber's sort of career baselines are probably more true an example of what Timber is, especially since he's already played a couple seasons with Arsenal and not much has radically changed within his role as a right back. So I think Timber's still exceptional when you compare him against the peers of the field, and he has still underperformed against that basis. But is he, for example, at the level of someone like a Munoz from an attacking point of view? I don't think so personally. And a couple of weeks ago, you probably could have actually said yes if you're just looking at underlying stats, but it just shows you how things change so quickly in FPL, which is why I think it is important to kind of look at maybe even going back to career numbers and to not overreact to just one season's worth of numbers. Virgil, of course, has gotten the goals recently. The reality in FPL, I think, is any sort of defender is capable of getting a 17-point haul, right? I mean, you've seen teams get jammy clean sheets. I don't think Virgil got a jammy clean sheet versus Sunderland. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. Liverpool's underlying stats, actually, from a defense point of view, have been super impressive from December. But I think the point to make is that it's not like Virgil has suddenly emerged as one of the best set-piece threats in the game. He always technically has been. But we've seen, 17-point hauls from Rodon, from Mukiele. This is all capable when you have the fixtures align, or at least one game week aligning, and I think that ultimately when you have 5 fixtures in a row that are really good, you're going to have more scope to do things like that, or at least to just consistently get points, right? 6 to 7 pointers, like for example, a lot of the Arsenal defenders have done over spurts in the season. So this is a great spurt for Virgil. That's why he rises. We're not overreacting to the haul. This is just more reaction to the fixture run ahead. Chalobah drops, similar sort of reason towards Enzo. Hall drops. I do have to say, if you want to call me out actually on the cheat sheet last week, I did drop Teo. I didn't drop Hall. Probably a terrible call. Since then, I think Teo has also scored another goal within the Champions League, and Hall, as I said, was benched within the previous match within the Premier League. So it shows you how much I've overread into, I guess, Hall's ability to stay fit. I did think, honestly, with the sort of lack of options that they have, that I'd probably think Burn would probably play more center back going forwards, but I mean, if there's scope to sort of bench Hall, and of course Newcastle are fighting on multiple fronts, and maybe Champions League at this moment in time is, I guess, maybe arguably more important, then that's not great for Hull if they continue to sort of, advance, and they will. So to me, Hull gets a drop. I've given Saliba a drop. I've kept Timber as a top option because I still think when you compare Timber to Saliba, there's not much separating them from an expected clean sheets perspective. But after that, it's basically just, who has the most goal threat. Timber, to me, despite sort of the criticisms that I've raised in terms of his numbers, is still far clear of Saliba, who is, I would say, a bit more gun shy compared to any of the options of the game, especially some of the center backs here within this list where you can actually look at their combined NPXGI. Yeah, he's not anywhere close to it. In fact, he's probably one of the worst options just flat out. So that's kind of it in terms of sort of my takes on defenders. And I think part of it too is almost saying if you want to sort of keep some of the Arsenal defenders, like that's the priority that I would keep them at. Calafiori has also been taken away from the list. Unfortunately, it seems like he's still suffering from a lot of knocks and just injury prone overall. So probably teaches me not to overreact to Calafiori, despite how sort of enticing he might be at times. And to close off the cheat sheet with the goalkeepers, I've given Salah drop, obviously coming out of the double. Henderson, we've kept him at where he's at. Raya, Pickford, Donnarumma all get drops because I just think that with the blank game week for Raya and Donnarumma, that's just going to hurt them. But with Pickford, of course, I just think that the fixture run for Everton is not particularly good, even though you've got Burnley at home in the distance. But yeah, the underlying stats still have not been that pretty or impressive for Everton. So that's going to be the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.